But when people try to argue that she's not the face of our league, or if our league would be where we're at without her, you're literally dumb as fuck.
Jealousy of Caitlin Clark was the topic of conversation. Sophie Cunningham was criticizing those who refused to acknowledge that Caitlin Clark is the face of the WNBA.
Cunningham letting it all out and not holding back. She calls out the old guard. She calls out the people out there who refuse to say Caitlin Clark is the face of the league.
Finally, someone who gets it. Finally, someone in the WNBA who understands this thing called business.
Hey, Sophie. If they didn't like you then, they sure aren't going to like you.
There was a moment when Indiana Fever fans had every reason to believe the future of their franchise had finally arrived. Caitlin Clark was changing everything. The crowds were getting bigger. Television ratings were climbing. Sponsorship interest was exploding. And everywhere the Fever went, fans showed up to watch one player who had become the biggest attraction in women's basketball. But then, something happened that left many fans asking a very uncomfortable question. Why would Indiana choose the same coach whose team had just eliminated Caitlin Clark from the playoffs and put that coach in charge of her future? That coach was Stephanie White. And the timing of the decision made the situation even more controversial. Because just weeks earlier, Clark had finished her first WNBA playoff series against White's Connecticut Sun. During that series, Clark took a painful hit near the eye, suffered heavy physical contact, and the Fever were eventually eliminated in 2 games. At the time, many fans thought Indiana would respond by searching for a coach who could protect its young superstar and build a championship-caliber team around her. Instead, Indiana went in a direction almost nobody expected. They hired Stephanie White, and that decision opened the floodgates. Fans began questioning the front office. Commentators debated the move. Social media exploded, and eventually, one of Caitlin Clark's own teammates began speaking openly about the culture surrounding the league. That teammate was Sophie Cunningham. Today, we're going piece by piece through the story, because this isn't simply about one coaching decision. It's about Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA, the enormous attention she brought with her, the physical challenges she faced during her first seasons, the controversial playoff series against Connecticut, Stephanie White's role in that story, and why Sophie Cunningham's comments caused so much discussion. So, let's go back to the beginning, when Indiana selected Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft. The Fever weren't simply getting another talented rookie. They were getting a player who had already transformed women's basketball at the college level. During her time at Iowa, Clark broke record after record. She became the all-time leading scorer in NCAA Division I basketball history, and developed a style of play that was incredibly difficult to ignore. Deep three-pointers, fast-paced offense, creative passing, no-look assists, and an ability to shoot from distances that forced defenders to guard her almost anywhere on the court. Her popularity followed her everywhere. College games featuring Clark drew enormous television audiences, and her final season at Iowa generated unprecedented attention for women's basketball. Then she entered the WNBA. Almost immediately, the Fever became one of the most watched teams in the league. Tickets that once cost relatively little were suddenly selling for dramatically higher prices. Opposing teams were moving games into larger arenas to accommodate increased demand. Television audiences were growing, and the league's overall profile was reaching a completely different level. For many fans, it felt like Clark had arrived at exactly the moment the WNBA needed a massive boost. But there was another side to the story. The attention surrounding Clark didn't disappear once she entered the professional league. It followed her onto the court. And almost from the beginning, she found herself dealing with an unusually physical environment. During her rookie season, Clark was involved in several highly discussed incidents involving hard contact. One of the most notable came against the Chicago Sky, when Chennedy Carter made contact with Clark away from the ball after play had stopped. The incident immediately went viral. The league initially treated it as a common foul before later upgrading the call to a flagrant foul following widespread discussion and review. Then there were other physical plays. More hard contact, more collisions. More debates about whether Clark was simply experiencing the normal treatment of a rookie or whether something else was happening. That distinction became one of the biggest arguments surrounding her first season. Supporters believed Clark was being targeted. Critics argued that physical basketball was simply part of the professional game. And somewhere in the middle was the uncomfortable reality that the cameras were now following almost every moment involving the league's most recognizable young player. Every hard foul became a headline. Every argument became a social media debate. Every controversial play was replayed thousands of times. Then came the 2024 playoffs, and that's where the story involving Stephanie White truly became complicated. On September 22, 2024, the Indiana Fever faced the Connecticut Sun in the opening round of the WNBA playoffs. For Indiana, it was a huge moment. The franchise hadn't reached the postseason since 2016, and Clark was playing in her first professional playoff series. On the opposite sideline was Connecticut head coach Stephanie White. Early in the game, Clark made a pass toward teammate Aaliyah Boston. It quickly became one of the most discussed images of the series. Now, to be fair, and for Indiana fans, the offseason began with a simple expectation. The team needed to get better. They needed stronger defense, better coaching, more depth, and perhaps most importantly, they needed someone who could help turn Clark's enormous talent into championship-level success. Then Indiana made its announcement. Christy Sides was out, and only days later the Fever revealed their new head coach, Stephanie White. That was the moment everything changed. Because from the front office's perspective, the decision made basketball sense. White had an impressive resume. She had deep Indiana connections. She had played for the Fever. She had been part of an Indiana championship organization. She had coaching experience at both the college and professional levels. And during her time with Connecticut, she had established herself as one of the respected coaches in the league. So from a purely basketball perspective, the hire could be defended. But fans don't always experience sports decisions through statistics and resumes. They remember moments. They remember images. They remember seeing their young superstar on the floor holding her face. And many Indiana supporters couldn't separate Stephanie White, the experienced coach, from Stephanie White, the coach standing on the opposite sideline during that playoff series. That emotional reaction became impossible to ignore. And then Sophie Cunningham entered the conversation. Because unlike a random social media commentator, Cunningham was now inside the Fever locker room. She was playing alongside Caitlin Clark. She had experienced the league herself, and she wasn't known for being afraid to speak her mind. When Cunningham began discussing Clark, the attention around the story grew even larger. She openly pushed back against the idea that Caitlin Clark wasn't the face of the league. Her argument was simple. If a player is bringing more attention, more viewers, more revenue, and more exposure to the entire league, then everyone around that player has an opportunity to benefit. And that statement touched a much bigger issue. Was the WNBA fully embracing the unprecedented attention Caitlin Clark was bringing to the sport, or were some people still struggling to accept just how much the league had changed? That question would become central to everything that followed. And Sophie Cunningham wasn't finished talking. In fact, her comments would eventually force fans to look at the entire Caitlin Clark story from a completely different perspective. Because the next part isn't just about what happened on the court. It's about what Cunningham claimed was happening behind the scenes, and why she believed jealousy and resentment had become part of the conversation surrounding Clark. And that's where this story gets much more interesting. But there was one person who didn't seem interested in staying quiet. Sophie Cunningham had already earned a reputation as one of the WNBA's most physical and outspoken players. She wasn't the type to carefully choose every word just to make everyone comfortable. And after joining Indiana, she suddenly found herself in the middle of the Caitlin Clark phenomenon. That changed everything. Cunningham had spent years in the league before becoming Clark's teammate. She knew what professional basketball looked like when the cameras weren't focused on every possession. She understood the physical side of the game, the pressure inside locker rooms, and the personalities that come with competing at the highest level. So when she started talking about Clark publicly, people paid attention. especially because Cunningham wasn't simply defending her teammate after one controversial play. She was talking about the bigger picture. According to Cunningham, the attention surrounding Clark should not be viewed as a problem for the rest of the league. It should be viewed as an opportunity. More viewers meant more exposure. More exposure meant more sponsorship opportunities. More attention meant more people discovering other players and teams. And from Cunningham's perspective, pretending that Clark wasn't driving a huge portion of that attention simply didn't make sense. Her comments struck a nerve because they challenged something that had been debated since Clark entered the league. Who exactly is the face of the WNBA? There are plenty of established stars, players who had spent years building the league, players with championships, all-star appearances, international careers, and enormous talent. Cunningham wasn't denying any of that. Her argument was that acknowledging Clark's enormous impact didn't erase what those players had accomplished. In fact, she believed the opposite. If one player brings millions of new eyes to the sport, everyone has a chance to benefit. And that's where the conversation became much bigger than Caitlin Clark. It became a conversation about the future of the entire league. For decades, the WNBA had fought for attention. The league had survived through years when television audiences were modest, teams struggled financially, and players had to work through conditions that were nowhere near the level of major men's professional sports. Then suddenly, one rookie arrived and the conversation changed almost overnight. Caitlin Clark wasn't responsible for every positive development in the WNBA, but the attention surrounding her was impossible to ignore. Every game became an event. Every road arena had a reason to care. Every major highlight could spread across social media within minutes. And Cunningham's point was essentially this: why fight that attention when you can use it to build the entire league? But then came another part of her comments that caused even more discussion. Cunningham suggested that jealousy could exist inside professional sports. That's a serious claim. And it is important not to turn an individual player's opinion into proof of what every player or coach believes. Cunningham was sharing her perspective. But because she was a veteran player speaking from inside the league, fans naturally wanted to know what experiences had shaped that perspective. And suddenly, her words were being connected to everything that had happened to Clark during her first seasons. The hard fouls, the controversies, the arguments over officiating, the endless debates about whether Clark received too much attention, and eventually the injuries. That final topic became especially important, because during the 2025 season, Caitlin Clark's biggest obstacle wasn't another defender. It was staying healthy. When Clark was actually on the court, the results were impressive. She continued producing points, rebounds, assists, steals, and three-pointers at an elite level. She earned another All-Star selection. The offense could look dangerous. The chemistry with her teammates appeared to be developing. But there was one major problem. Clark couldn't stay on the floor. Injuries repeatedly interrupted her season. A player who had become the centerpiece of Indiana's future was suddenly watching games from the sideline. And every time Clark went down, the conversation started again. Was she being overworked? Was the physical nature of the league catching up with her? Was the workload from her rookie season still affecting her? Or was there something else going on? Different people offered different explanations. But Sophie Cunningham strongly rejected one particular theory. Some commentators suggested that Clark's struggles might have been connected to the mental pressure surrounding her. Cunningham pushed back hard. Her argument was straightforward. For an elite athlete, not being able to play is already one of the most difficult experiences imaginable. You don't need to invent another explanation. An injured player wants nothing more than to get back onto the court. And Cunningham made it clear that she believed Clark was doing everything she could to return. That defense of her teammate mattered because Cunningham wasn't speaking as a distant observer. She was sharing the locker room with Clark. She was watching the recovery process firsthand. She saw the frustration that comes with missing games. And she understood what it meant for a competitor like Clark to be forced into street clothes while her teammates were playing. But the conversation about Clark's injuries eventually brought the story back to Stephanie White, because now fans were looking at the 2025 season through a completely different lens. White had arrived with a reputation as a highly accomplished coach. Cunningham was publicly defending Clark. Clark was dealing with injuries. And fans were still remembering the playoff series against Connecticut. That made every new development feel connected to the previous season. And then there was Dejonai Carrington. Carrington had been coached by Stephanie White in Connecticut. She had experienced a breakout season under White and had become one of the league's most aggressive defensive players. She was also the player involved in the controversial eye contact incident with Clark during that 20 only weeks later. White was announced as Clark's new head coach. That sequence created a connection in the minds of fans. Whether that connection was fair or not is another question. But it was understandable why people were talking. Because sports aren't only about statistics. They're also about emotion. Fans remember what they see. They remember who was standing on which sideline. They remember the moments that made them angry. And when Indiana hired White, those memories didn't disappear. They followed her into the Fever organization. Then the 2025 season began. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Stephanie White could coach. Her resume had already answered that. The question was whether she could take Caitlin Clark and the Fever to the next level. Early signs suggested there was potential. When Clark played, the offense could be highly effective. The ball moved. The team had structure, and White's experience appeared to be making a difference. But the biggest problem couldn't be solved with a playbook. Caitlin Clark wasn't available often enough. And that changed the entire conversation. Instead of discussing championship possibilities, fans were discussing injury updates. Instead of debating Clark's next record, they were waiting for news about whether she could even suit up. Instead of seeing the superstar at the center of the court, they were seeing her sitting on the bench. And that was painful for Indiana supporters, because they had seen what the Fever could become when Clark was healthy. They had witnessed the crowds. They had witnessed the attention. They had witnessed the transformation. Now they were watching the centerpiece of that transformation struggle to stay on the floor. And once again, social media did what social media always does. It connected every event, every injury, every coaching decision, every controversial moment, every old playoff clip. And suddenly, the Stephanie White hiring was being discussed all over again. But there was still one question nobody could answer simply. Was this really about Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark? Or was it part of a much bigger struggle over how the WNBA should handle the unprecedented attention surrounding its biggest new star? Because if Sophie Cunningham was right about one thing, this wasn't going to be solved by one coach. It was a conversation about the entire league. And the deeper fans looked into the numbers, the history, and the changes happening around the WNBA, the more complicated the story became. Because Caitlin Clark hadn't simply entered the league. She had changed the conversation around it. And that created both opportunity and tension. But this is where the story becomes much bigger than one coaching decision. Because the real question was never simply, is Stephanie White a good coach? The more complicated question was, what happens when the biggest new star in your league suddenly changes the economics, attention, and expectations of the entire sport? For decades, the WNBA had been fighting for recognition. Players had spent years competing in front of smaller crowds, working with limited resources, and trying to convince the wider sports world that women's basketball deserved the same level of attention as every other professional sport. Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and suddenly, everything accelerated. The attention wasn't limited to Indiana. It followed Clark to opposing arenas. It followed her into television broadcasts. It followed her onto social media, and it followed every other player who shared the court with her. That created an opportunity unlike anything the league had experienced before. But it also created an uncomfortable reality. Not everyone was going to react to that transformation in the same way. Some players embraced the increased attention. Others questioned whether the focus on one player was overshadowing the stars who had already built the league. And that disagreement became one of the defining conversations of Clark's early WNBA career.